So we're going to spend a few slides talking about attachment in childhood. And attachment's one of my favorite things to talk about. And we'll revisit this actually at the end of the semester when we talk about attachment in romantic relationships. So research is really pointing to the fact that attachment seems to be hardwired into our DNA and into our neurobiology. It's not just about little kids and their parents. It's about us throughout our lives. And we definitely have neural connections in our brains that fire up when we are with or apart from our attachment figures. The Attachment Why It Matters video is excellent. I actually recommend it for all new parents. And it's a many-hour series, and we're just watching the introductory part. It's designed more specifically for parents who have adopted children later in life, often out of foster situations, who might need even more help building a secure attachment, but it's useful for all parents no matter what their situation. It's going to be really important to watch this to have a sense of what the attachment styles look like, and specifically in the Strange Situation experiment by Mary Ainsworth, that was designed by Mary Ainsworth, has been done by thousands of people. And then you'll also get some information about what this means for attachment styles over time. Adoption is addressed in the film, and basically the earlier the adoption occurs, the better the outcomes are for attachment. And this is because of the neuroplasticity or the brain plasticity that we talked about during infancy, the brain being the most plastic between the years of 0 and 3, but particularly those first 6 months. And so if a child is living in a more deprived or unpredictable environment, then they're not kind of laying down the neural pathways for attachment security. However, attachment is never set in stone, right? It's flexible throughout our lives, and so it's still possible to create secure attachment for kids who didn't get that early on. It just becomes a little bit more work. And so, for example, I have a friend who adopted a daughter from Ethiopia around a year, and so one thing that they did, she and her husband, were to only have them diaper, feed, or kind of soothe their daughter so that she would really learn who her key attachment figures are. John Bowlby is considered the father of attachment theory. He was British, and he was trained in the Freudian tradition and then really found that that didn't explain what he was witnessing in his work with children, especially children who had to be separated from their parents due to tuberculosis or due to war. And John Bowlby met with lots of different people across different fields as he was building attachment theory, and he was influenced by Harry Harlow in his famous rhesus monkeys experiment, which found that when baby rhesus monkeys who had been separated from their real mother were startled or surprised, they had the choice of going to two false mothers, either a wire mother that provided food or a soft cloth mother. Basically, they would go to the soft terry cloth mother in times of distress and preferred to spend more time hanging out with her in general, even when they weren't distressed. And so what this really showed us is that attachment and connection isn't about who has the food source. It's more about kind of a tactile sense of comfort. So John Bowlby really theorized, and lots of research since has provided support that attachment is a key bond that, basically ensures our survival, that it's normal to have key attachment figures, and kind of have an attachment hierarchy as to who's the most important that you turn to, and you might have a couple of people at the top of your hierarchy, and that attachment is both about independence and dependence, and that's what secure base behavior means. It basically means when you have someone you can truly depend on, then you can be autonomous and explore your world as a kid or, as a grown-up. So it's about both autonomy and connection. So as children are forming secure attachments with their caregivers, a very normal process is to show some stranger anxiety, and this usually starts ramping up around 8 months, and you can see it peaks at around a year and a half, and then can decline but still extend up to 2.5 or 3. And so what this often looks like is you may have seen this where you've got a young, a baby or toddler who doesn't want you to hold them, right? They only want to be held by their primary caregiver, whether that's their mom or dad or grandparent. And so they kind of, will shy away. They'll lean away from you, or they'll cry when they get placed in someone else's arms. Or, of course, with daycare, this is a very challenging time to drop kids off. And the way I think about this is that it's normal for little kids to be more rigid in the beginning about who their attachment figures are. It's a healthy sign. My brother-in-law, for example, when my niece was around, 2, was saying things like, "We've got to break her of this habit if she didn't want to be held by me. She's not being, polite, right?" And I said to him, "No, this is a really good sign that she doesn't want to be held by me, that she only wants to be held by you and my sister-in-law, because that means she knows who her people are." And so I think kids are more rigid in the beginning, and then they'll get more flexible. So this is just details the strange situation experiment that was developed by Mary Ainsworth to measure the attachment security between a caregiver and a baby or a toddler. You saw this in the video, Attachment, Why It Matters. And the main thing is to know is that how this experiment works, and it's been replicated thousands of times, is that it pays attention to how the baby interacts with the parent as compared to the stranger, which is just a researcher, how the baby reacts when the caregiver or parent leaves, and how the baby reacts when the caregiver or parent returns. So these are the Ainsworth attachment styles that you saw described on the Attachment, Why It Matters video. And it's important to note that these only characterize a child's relationship with any caregiver at any given point in time. So you could repeat the strange situation experiment with the same child but a different caregiver, and they might show a different pattern, or you could repeat it with the same caregiver months down the road, and perhaps something has changed and the relationship has become more secure or more insecure. So key features of the secure attachment styles: when the caregiver is there, the child is able to explore the toys and often kind of references the caregiver when the stranger comes in, kind of connects with them a little bit. The child is usually upset when the caregiver leaves, and is usually kind of soothed and relieved when the caregiver returns. When a baby is more anxious ambivalent, the child can be more clingy and have a harder time exploring toys. Not always. Is again similar levels of upset when the caregiver leaves, but maybe is harder to soothe and more upset when the caregiver returns, maybe mad that they were left. And then avoidant, as you saw, the child looks very kind of calm and independent. They don't seem to connect too much with the caregiver when they're initially playing with the toys. They're more focused on the toys. They seem to react similarly to the stranger and the caregiver. They don't seem so fazed when the caregiver is gone or when they return. But then what you also heard about in the video is that even though they are not showing a lot of emotion, they are showing the same levels of increased cortisol in their urine as the other babies. So they are physiologically stressed, but they are disguising that stress. And so they've basically learned, even at an early age, that amping up doesn't get their needs met. And so they kind of cope by focusing on toys or tasks. And then Mary Main added a fourth attachment style where it's more mixed, where the child might show a fearful response, or might hide, or might walk, kind of come to the parent, but then turn their back on them. And so that would be the fourth one. So across cultures, most all toddlers, infants and toddlers, exhibit secure attachment in the strange situations study. But there are some cultural differences. And so you can see that in Germany, avoidant attachment is more common than anxious resistant attachment. And in Japan, anxious resistant attachment, for example, is higher than avoidant. And so how this is explained is, German culture is typically more stoic and more tough. So more kind of socializing kids to hide their emotions when they're in distress. And Japanese culture places, as a collectivist culture, actually places more emphasis on children being dependent. Mothers want their children to really focus in on them and be dependent on them before they become too independent. This slide just details what the parenting quality is that's often associated with each attachment style. And, this is just in general. And you could imagine that parents, again, could vary. You could have one parent exhibiting one style and another parent exhibiting another. And parents can also change over time. So for parents who are creating more of a secure attachment style, they are in general able to be more kind of sensitive, responsive, and positive to kids. Not perfectly, but most of the time. When parents are creating more of an anxious, resistant attachment style with a child, they basically can be a little overwhelming to the child, or a little bit intrusive or unpredictable. So sometimes they seem kind of safe and you can rely on them, and other times they maybe are startling or shaming. And then anxious avoidant generally is kind of dismissing, maybe pushing away when kids are upset, encouraging them to be tough, not show a lot of, emotion, not kind of, supporting a lot of neediness or crying. And then disorganized or disoriented is usually when the caregiver is either abusive or has kind of their own unresolved trauma or grief that is making it really hard for them to be present with their kids. And so if we were in class, you would see that students answered all kinds of things here. And so the main takeaway point is I just want you to know that you're not alone, whatever your attachment experiences were. And that even though many of us got the short end of the stick in life early on, we can, through our own kind of personal work and counseling or therapy and consciousness in relationships, really change our attachment style. So again, attachment can vary. You may have secure attachment with one parent and not with another. About 30% of kids, for example, have attachment security with one parent but not with the other. But research clearly says that there's both short-term benefits and long-term benefits, and there's quite a lot of research on this. So in the short term, kids are more responsive, smiling, interacting with their caregivers. They actually cry less and are soothed more easily. And this is kind of counterintuitive because you would think that if a caregiver is soothing them more, that maybe they are not learning to soothe themselves, but it's almost like because they can trust at a basic level that their needs are going to be taken care of, they don't have to enter such a state of distress. And then over the long term, kids generally basically behave better both in the home and also at school over the long term. So great benefits for attachment security. So the answer to this one is attachment. So just like we've talked before, we can make a broad statement like attachment security really matters for kids' behavior. But then, of course, it depends. And research is suggesting that it depends on differential susceptibility, again, in the orchid dandelion hypothesis. So this was a study that measured RSA, which is respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is related to vagal tone. And vagal tone is the ability to kind of regulate your heart in response to environmental stimuli. It's basically your ability to turn on your parasympathetic nervous system and calm yourself down. And so it's good to have low respiratory sinus arrhythmia. That's an indicator, as I understand it, of high vagal tone. So the kids who are more reactive have high respiratory sinus arrhythmia and are the orchids. And so this is a differential susceptibility study that didn't measure temperament and didn't measure genetics or epigenetics. It actually measured a biomarker, or the endophenotype, for a child. And so what you can see here is that they did an attachment classification at 5 months, and they really made this into kind of the strongest attachment and the worst attachment, or the least ideal attachment of disorganized, so the more dramatically different ones. And then they also got a baseline level of respiratory sinus arrhythmia at 5 months, and then classified kind of low below the mean and high above the mean. And then they measured problem behavior at 17 months. And so what you can see there is that attachment really just mattered for the sensitive kids, much more so than the dandelion kids, which is consistent with what we've talked about before. This is a similar idea, but it's talking about intervention. So this study targeted economically stressed mothers in the hospital and then assessed the newborns for irritability using a neonatal behavioral assessment scale. And then the 20% of the most irritable infants were selected, and they for intervention. And you can see then that the intervention group received 3 in-home visits with one-on-one coaching, and they videotaped interactions and gave the caregivers feedback on how to be more sensitive and responsive to babies. And what you can see is that the attachment intervention made a little bit of difference for the moderately irritable babies, but really made a bigger difference for the highly irritable babies. So just like we've been talking about, goodness of fit and responsive caregiving matters, but it matters most really for the kids that are the hardest to give it to. So up until this point, I've really been talking about attachment security as predicted by caregiver responsiveness and sensitivity, but it's important to kind of broaden our model a little bit and see that, yes, differential susceptibility of the child, and to be honest, the parent, although we're not talking about that here, plays a role, right? And it's much easier to form a secure attachment with a dandelion than it is with an orchid. And then environmental stress influences attachment security, because it's a lot harder to be a sensitive and responsive caregiver when you're in a highly stressed environment, and it's harder for kids to regulate themselves in highly stressed environments. And now the model goes on to say, so what does this mean for how we form relationships over time? How can attachment security early on have such predictive power in our success, academically, with our peers, in romantic relationships? And so this is a model suggested by Diamond that I've adapted here, where basically attachment security influences how, as a baby, you calibrate, and toddler, you calibrate your stress systems, essentially your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and your automatic nervous system, how you kind of manage that balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic, kind of turning on, activating into fight or flight, and calming back down. So then this influences how you regulate emotions and respond to stress, which basically influences how well you can do this interpersonally or with others, which then influences how likely it is that you can form high quality relationships. Okay, so if you're not already stirred up by attachment, which makes us feel pretty vulnerable, now we're talking about child maltreatment, which is another tough topic. And the child maltreatment slides there, I'll guide you on the study guide, but there will be very minimal questions about this on the exam, but it is a really important topic, and so I include it mainly for your education and reference. Okay, so some of the key points that I want to make right off the bat is that abuse and neglect, or child maltreatment, is really common. And so just even in our class, there's going to have been a lot of kids, a lot of you all who have experienced this as kids. And so you can see up there that just in 2014, over 3 million children, or about 4%, were actually received an investigation or contact from Child Protective Services. then only about 1% overall of the population had substantiated, meaning that Child Protective Services kind of intervened and said, yes, abuse or neglect has been occurring. When we look at this over a lifetime, it's hard to get these estimates, but we're estimating that maybe a quarter of kids have experienced some form of maltreatment in the United States in their lives. Okay, so first, the research says that kids under 3 are particularly at risk for abuse and neglect, and high for infants. They're also the highest risk of fatality, and then toddlers as well, toddlers and early preschoolers. And so, if you're wondering why is this, because they're so cute, but they're also so hard, right? During this age, they're very time intensive, they're overstimulating. They're not in school yet. They can't verbally say what they need. They can't also verbally talk about the abuse, so that in some ways, puts them at risk because they can't, share it with others. But I think mainly it's that parents can get more frustrated and overwhelmed. And basically their stress levels exceed their coping abilities, and they behave in ways that they later regret. Toddler behavior, they're getting into everything. That, the Erikson stages are about exploration and initiation and autonomy. And so toddlers, they're very busy, and again, their behavior can sometimes be misinterpreted as intentionally being bad when they're just doing their developmental tasks. So what's important to know is that the vast majority of child abuse is perpetrated by parents, and these parents aren't monsters. These parents are all of us who basically have gotten too stressed, who may have experienced abuse themselves growing up, and so are replicating those patterns. And so they're basically just don't have the resources that they need to be good parents. I've talked, a number of times with our Department of Human Services and Child Protective Services, and they say rarely do they meet a parent who's like a true, sociopath or psychopath. Most of the time, these are, just good people who aren't doing such a great job at this moment. And we'll talk more about some predictors for parents. So one thing that I didn't note on the previous slide is that it may have surprised you that mothers are the most common perpetrators of child maltreatment, and that's generally because mothers are the primary caregivers. Fathers are also perpetrators, and when it's more violent or lethal, it's more likely to be fathers. Okay, so in terms of abuse and neglect, neglect is the most common. We're going to get into some of these definitions here in a little bit. By far the most common, followed by physical abuse, then sexual abuse, then psychological abuse or neglect, which we'll talk about. It's actually probably one of the most common, but it's the hardest to substantiate or kind of demonstrate. What you can also see is that child maltreatment often co-occurs with caregiver substance abuse issues. So that's important to note. If you're working in the field of child maltreatment, you always have to be screening for substance use issues. And if you're working with parents around substance use issues, you always want to be screening for child maltreatment. So before we go a lot further, I'd like to just point out who's mandated to report child abuse and neglect, because many of you are going into fields where you're going to be a mandated reporter. Who is mandated varies by state, so I've got 2 slides here of who's mandated here in the state of Colorado. And what you can see on this slide is basically anybody who's in a medical profession or working in a school setting at all is first a mandated reporter. And then on this slide, you can basically see anybody who's working as a therapist in any capacity, and then also firefighters, veterinarians, because it often co-occurs with animal abuse, police officers, pharmacists, and because it used to say commercial film and print photography because of people used to develop film, right? And that was child pornography, and also clergy members. So again, all definitions of child maltreatment vary by state, and here in Colorado, the CRS, Colorado Revised Statute, basically says that physical neglect is about failure to provide for a child's basic needs, or their medical care, or also failure to provide supervision. And you can see this clause that a prudent parent would take. And what it means to be a prudent parent in our society is often changing over time, what we think is prudent parenting. So it can be this gray area sometimes. And prudent parent also is specific to that parent's situation. So what a prudent parent who's living in a homeless shelter would do is different than what a prudent parent who has a home would do. So you do have to kind of take into account the situation. You can be a homeless parent who's being prudent and isn't, perpetrating physical neglect. So there is a difference between poverty and physical neglect. So educational neglect means failure of a parent or a caretaker to enroll a child of mandatory school age, which is age 6 to 17 in school, or allow chronic truancy. This is why if children and adolescents are running away, you should be reporting them to the police as a parent, because otherwise it's educational neglect. It's actually educational neglect for school and physical neglect because they're leaving home. Medical neglect is not providing necessary health care. But the one that I think that we need to think about the most is appropriate supervision, because this is what often happens in the case of substance use, is that a parent is using a substance, and so they are not adequately providing adequate supervision for their children. And so, what I often say is you can be drunk as a parent, but you can't be the only person supervising if you're drunk or you're high. You've got to have another adult there. So it's not great parenting, right, to get drunk every evening or to get high every evening and not be in a capacity to care for your kids should they need you. But it's not neglect unless you're the only one there. And so, for example, when a child talks to a therapist and says, my younger brother was throwing up, and I tried to get my dad, who was the only one home because his girlfriend was gone, to take care of him, but he was passed out on the couch. That's physical neglect, right? Or I often thought about this in party situations where the grown-ups are, having their margaritas or their martinis or their whatever, and the kids are running in a pack through the neighbors' backyards. Somebody has got to be keeping an eye on the kids and making sure somebody doesn't get hurt, because if they get hurt and an ambulance shows up to the scene and you're tipsy and you were not supervising your kids adequately, then you're in the realm of physical neglect. So physical abuse is basically, by Colorado definition, leaving a mark or doing something that really had serious risk of harm, which is called an injurious environment. So this could be, for example, having a big physical altercation in front of little kids because they could get hurt if you have got domestic violence in front of them or kind of in it right around them, or kind of, could be driving under the influence. I'm never sure if driving under the influence falls under physical neglect or physical abuse, but you're creating basically an injurious environment if you've got your kids in the car. But basically it has to be non-accidental. So I'll just give you a quick example of when my husband and I were really screened for physical abuse. When my daughter was maybe about 4 or 5 years old, my husband was pushing her on a longboard through the neighborhood, and she liked to just sit on the longboard and have him kind of push her with his foot. And they went away in the neighborhood that they hadn't gone before, and she went down a little incline and then hit a lip in the sidewalk and basically face planted off the longboard, onto her mouth, and her tooth kind of punctured into her lip, and there was a lot of blood. And so we had to go to both the doctor and the dentist in the same day, and they were really screening us for basically physical abuse, either that we had done something intentionally or that we had been basically imprudent parents and created an injurious environment. Like, were we letting our little daughter ride out unsupervised, and get hurt, or did we get mad, and lead to this injury? So those would be examples of how it could have been physical abuse. If I'm fighting with my son as he gets older in the kitchen and he storms out and he accidentally kind of falls and hits his head, that's not physical abuse. But if I pushed him out of the kitchen and I didn't mean for him to fall and hit his head, but he did, and now he has a cut and he needs stitches, now I'm in kind of this gray zone of physical abuse because my anger created an injurious environment. Okay, so sexual abuse is obviously difficult to talk about, and it's all the things that we know, in terms of sexual assault, molestation, child pornography, sex trafficking. But it also is when a child is used for the sexual gratification of another, and this could be, as simple as showing a child pornography, whether you're a teenager or you're an adult, and somehow getting a thrill about that. That's considered your own sexual gratification, and so you can't expose children to inappropriate material. And then emotional abuse, as I mentioned, is the hardest to. Oh, actually, let me go back and just say a little bit more about sexual abuse. So we have agencies here in town, for example, Child Safe, that really specializes in supporting kids and families following child sexual abuse. And I'll talk more about reporting or kind of gathering information here on the next slide. Emotional abuse, as I mentioned, is the most common form, likely, but you have to, in order to substantiate emotional abuse, you have to say it has impaired the child's basically intellectual and psychological functioning, or that it's at risk of impairing them. And so that's harder to demonstrate, that because they're not doing well in school is because of, how you've been talking to them. But basically, when parents are rejecting, demeaning kind of consistently, terrorizing, or using kids. Okay, so this is really important information, is that even though you might be a mandated reporter, you're not an investigator. And so you are just trying to kind of get a sense of potential red flags around abuse. All you have to have is a reasonable suspicion, as we're going to be talking about. You don't have to have proof in order to report. And so you want to be careful about interviewing kids because, as you know, there's all the research around false memory syndrome. Memories are kind of sensitive things, and so we could plant ideas, and then if a child starts kind of changing their story a lot, then they don't become so reliable. So if you already kind of have a reasonable suspicion, you don't actually have to talk with the kid. If a child is basically spontaneously indicating some things that are raising red flags for you, you can just get what are called minimal facts. What happened? Who did it? Where were you? And when did it happen? And so we have now basically trained services, forensic interviewers who are trained in how to interview kids. And we try to just interview them, minimally, like one time, record the interview. We have agencies in town who do that. And then that interview can be replayed, through law enforcement proceedings or child protective service work. But we don't have to keep interviewing the child. So as we talked about, this is mothers. Mothers in general are more likely to have higher rates of child maltreatment. But if we're looking more specifically at sexual abuse or violent physical abuse, then that's more likely to be a male family member. So we've talked about brain plasticity and how kind of early experiences wire up our brains more powerfully even than later experiences, that neurons that fire together kind of wire together, that the synapses and connections that you use are the ones that you keep, and the ones that you don't use are the ones that you lose. And so what you could imagine is that if you are experiencing higher rates of maltreatment as a child, then your brain is running its fear pathways a lot, and those pathways are getting strengthened. And that can lead to you having greater hypervigilance, kind of watching for danger as you get older, greater anxiety, kind of focusing on the ways people's faces look, the way heightened production of stress hormones, kind of paying attention to people's tone of voices. And so and this can even be reflected in brainwave activity. But again, as we're going to see on this next slide, differential susceptibility plays a role. So this was a differential susceptibility using genes, and it was genetic plasticity across 4 genes or alleles, plasticity alleles that are associated with differential susceptibility. And then it was a resilience score of kids ages 6 through 12, so basically elementary school, where they were rated by themselves, their peers, their teachers, and their counselors on how pro-social or aggressive or withdrawn or depressive or internalizing or externalizing they were. And so, and then also a maltreatment score. And so what you can see is that those kids that had almost no plasticity alleles of the 4 that they investigated were the dandelions. And so their level of kind of, aggressive or pro-social behavior didn't shift as much, which is that resilient functioning score. It didn't shift as much based on whether or not they'd been maltreated or not maltreated. But for the kids who were high, had the most plasticity alleles, then if they were maltreated, they had the lowest resilience functioning score, basically the poorest kind of behavior, most kind of anxiety and depression. And if they weren't maltreated, then they had the highest resilience functioning score. So again, the orchid experience is more extreme for better or for worse. So I alluded to some of this already, but why is it that some caregivers struggle more than others? What are the predictors of being abusive as a caregiver or maltreating a child? And so definitely kind of ongoing poverty and living in stressful environments, having your own history of abuse, and not enough education about, again, normal child development, so that you think a child is being bad when in fact they're just being appropriate for their age. And then current challenges, we talked already about how substance abuse is a big risk factor. If you're in a relationship that's stressful or violent, so intimate partner violence is also a risk factor, not having enough social support or having other kind of acute stress happening. Here are the things that decrease risk of abuse. So we've all heard about kind of that importance of having a mentor or protective people in your life. So sometimes we grow up and our caregivers weren't there for us, but maybe somebody else was, a coach or a teacher was a supportive person for us. If you can create a strong, healthy relationship with a partner, that's a protective factor. And then if you've kind of done some of your own work to process maybe the things that weren't ideal from your own childhood, especially if there was abuse, then that decreases your risk of perpetuating that yourself as a parent. And then the short-term factors are anything that can reduce stress and increase social support, getting out of an abusive relationship. Kids going into school decreases kind of the intensity of your caregiving, and of course getting kind of crisis intervention or counseling. Okay, so this goes back to being a mandated reporter in the state of Colorado, and so here's the laws around that, additional laws around that. This first one just basically says that if you are reporting, if you are a mandated reporter and you're, or anybody really, and you're reporting in good faith, then you're protected from kind of criminal or civil liability. So nobody can sue you for making an untrue statement about them. Now, if you're divorcing and you're trying to get child more parenting time or more custody, and you accuse your spouse of being abusive and they're not, that's not in good faith, and then you could be charged, in some way. And this statute also indicates that your reports to the Department of Human Services should be confidential, and we'll be getting into that, how to report, in just a minute. And basically, a failing to report within 24 hours of reasonable suspicion of abuse is a misdemeanor. And so I think this is really important for all of us going out into our work. Sometimes we're the only one, and we're in private practice as a therapist, and so we are reporting within 24 hours. But sometimes what I hear from students is, they're working somewhere in a child care facility, and they are wondering if it's their supervisor's kind of responsibility to report, and maybe their supervisor isn't taking it as seriously or isn't reporting. I would say, to cover yourself, if you don't think they're going to report within 24 hours, you should call in and report, because you're still a mandated reporter. Okay, so I've called Child Protective Services or Department of Health and Human Services here in town quite a number of times. They are so nice and helpful. Sometimes I've even called them with families as a counselor who I have to report, and I'll call while I'm in the room with the family and report so that everything's really transparent. If that feels, if it's a family where you can do that and it feels safe. And then let the family talk to the caseworker, who's always very kind and supportive. Our Larimer County Health and Human Services is really geared towards keeping families together. We've gone away from a model of trying to remove kids unless it's a truly dangerous situation, injurious environment, or in cases of sexual abuse, usually the perpetrator is removed from the home. But otherwise, we are really trying to kind of keep families together. So you can call. Generally, someone answers the phone. And if you're ever not sure if you should be calling something in or not, you can do what we call a hypothetical. You don't have to give names right away. You can call and say, here's the situation. Do you think that I should be calling this in? There is another reason why it's important to call is that Department of Health and Human Services doesn't go out on every call. They get, thousands of calls, and they have to decide whether or not it reaches the level that reaches the threshold of investigation. They only go out on about 35% of the calls. And so one thing that I've heard from them is, even though they only go out on about 35% of calls, if they get a call from 3 different people with a concern about a child or a family, then they will contact that family, even if it doesn't reach their threshold of concern. So that's another reason why you might think, oh, maybe it's nothing, but if you knew that 2 other people had also called it in, not being sure, that would kind of strengthen your confidence in calling it in. DHS is really trying to resolve things without criminal charges. The court only gets involved in about 20% of cases here in town, and so most of the time what they're doing is just helping connect kind of parents with a whole menu of counseling services for themselves and their kids here in town. So here's a little bit more about what you could expect to be asked, and so you want to try to have this information in front of you when you call, if possible. This is why it can make challenging to make a report in something you witness, in the Walmart parking lot or Walmart, because you just may not have enough information for them to follow up. Okay, last slide here on information you might be asked when you're calling in. And then I also just want to say, again, child maltreatment is really common. Many of you listening have experienced this or know someone close to you who has. And so if you need more support and resources around this, please don't hesitate to let me know, and I'd be glad to hook you up. Okay, just a final slide kind of on toddlerhood and preschool and thinking about what's happening in your virtual child. So just encouraging you to reflect on what's happening in your virtual child with what we're talking about overall in this PowerPoint on how kids are learning to maybe regulate themselves or get along with others.